Moving right along, we've got our second part of our Crusades lectures. This is the sixth video that we have for our Middle Ages unit as we're kind of working our way through not only the European Middle Ages, but also our Crusades worksheets. So we ended in the last video on the Second Crusade, so we should be flipping our paper over to the backside at the top. We're going to work our way through the Third Crusade today, Fourth Crusade, as well as some of the other crusades and the effect of the crusades on Europe. Key thing to understand when we talk about the Third Crusade is that 40 years are going to transpire between the end of the Second Crusade and when the Third Crusade is rocking and rolling. During this interim, the Muslims are going to very much consolidate their forces, and we'll talk about that in a second, and very much offer a much more stiffer resistance, as well as, again, they've now lost Jerusalem to the Crusaders after the success of the first Crusade. They want it back. So this consolidation of the Muslims in the Middle East is going to take place under the leadership of the Kurdish warrior and Muslim leader Saladin or Salah ad-Din. And he's going to be able to rise up from kind of military obscurity to be able to successfully play off the different factions in the Middle East to unite the Islamic world there. So he's successfully able to play off the Abbasids in Damascus and the Fatimids in Egypt, Alexandria, to be able to unite the Islamic world under his leadership, and then from there give them a common goal of not working against each other, but working with each other to be able to force the Crusaders out of Jerusalem. So between the Second and Third Crusade, the Muslim forces are able to unite and begin their attack on the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187. They're able to lure the Frankish army out of the city of Jerusalem's walls. And at the Battle of Hattin, near the Horns of Hattin, the Frankish army is encircled and destroyed, leaving the city of Jerusalem pretty much defenseless for the most part. Salah ad-Din then goes and marches on the city. On October 2nd of 1187, he enters Jerusalem. If you remember back to the first part of the Crusades that we did, the last video, when the Crusaders entered into Jerusalem in the first Crusade, they slaughtered everyone. We talked about literal rivers of blood flowing through the city as the Jerusalem slaughtered Muslims, Jews, and other Christians alike just for being there. So when Salah ad-Din enters the city, he and the Muslim forces just say that any remaining Christians have to pay a tax, a sizable tax, but nothing super onerous. And if they were unable to pay, then they would be enslaved. So he doesn't go in there and start destroying like the first Crusaders did when they retook the city in the first Crusade. The Muslims have now taken the city of Jerusalem. They begin marching on the other Crusader states. They're able to win back some of them. However, they are unable to take the city of Tyre. And this remains the last Christian city in Palestine, which gives the Crusaders a toehold to be able to have some sort of way to be able to work their way back towards now retaking the city of Jerusalem that they just lost. So this is one interpretation of Saladin. This is another visual. We don't interpretation. We don't have a lot of good, solid ideas of what he would look like from the time period. But what we see here is that again, Saladin able to rise up, unite the Muslim forces, and be able to kind of work their way towards Jerusalem. Like we said, they lure the uh, Frankish army out of the city walls of Jerusalem to the Horns of Hattin. There, the Frankish knights who have been marching in Jerusalem in the summertime, right, in the desert. Salah ad-Din had kind of mirrored the march of these warriors with his cavalry, who he ordered to kind of ride around to kick up a whole bunch of dust. Is these Frankish warriors were then pretty much annihilated or captured to the man at this battle, which did not go very well for the Crusaders. They've now lost Jerusalem, so it makes sense for our Third Crusade. Why is it called? A series of popes call for the crusade to take place in December of 1187 to retake Jerusalem yet again. Now, the Third Crusade is a little bit interesting in who goes on the crusade. So we can talk about the Third Crusade having another name, being referred to sometimes as the King's Crusade, because unlike the other crusades, three major kings of Europe take up the cross to go on this. In Germany, you have Frederick Barbarossa. In France, you have Philip Augustus. And in England, you have Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart. These three kings vow to retake Jerusalem. You have to remember this is almost 100 years into this idea of crusading, so it's kind of well established of where you're going, what the route is, what's going on there, and now there's a much more tangible goal as people have decided we need to retake Jerusalem. Frederick Barbarossa takes the overland route towards the Middle East. And when he is crossing one of the rivers in his giant suits of armor, he goes and slips and falls. Suit of armor fills with water. He can't stand up and he drowns. Frederick Barbarossa, one of the larger figures in German history up until this point. He's going to loom very large in the history of not only the Middle Ages, which we don't have a whole lot of time to get into his whole backstory, but he's going to be a big deal. Barbarossa translates to red-headed, shock of red hair. He's a real big deal in medieval history, particularly in the Central European medieval history. And Germans are going to look to him for a long time. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazis invade the Soviet Union on June 22nd of 1941, they're going to name their invasion of Germany Operation Barbarossa after this king. Richard and Philip take a different approach. They arrive by sea and arrive in the Middle East in April of 1191. They march from Tyre to the first major event of the Third Crusade and help lift the siege and capture the city of Acre in July of 1191. This is when Philip says, I'm good, I'm ready to go back home. He goes back home and begins to conspire with Richard of England's brother, King John, back in England, and there's a whole lot of stuff as they're trying to conspire for the throne there. So to reiterate, the three major kings that go on the Third Crusade are Frederick Barbarossa, who you see here. This is Richard the Lionheart's tomb that he has back in England. So again, they go help lift the siege of Acre. There, the Muslim forces are asked to either um, convert to Catholicism or die, and a large sum of them choose to be executed and die for their faith. You can see King Richard the Lionheart. We know he's that because of the three lions there of the crest of the kings of England. After the loss of Acre, Muslims become distrustful of Saladin because this is kind of the first major setback that he sees that. So Richard and the Crusaders are able to take advantage of this distrust of this bickering in the Muslim camp by slowly working their way down the eastern edge of the Mediterranean southwards from Acre towards Jerusalem. And Richard is able to start to bring back several of these coastal cities under Crusader control. And they do a pretty good job of being able to march in a military formation along the coast and not have to worry about supplies because the supplies are in a supply fleet moving down the coast on the Mediterranean as it is. Importantly, in January and in July of 1192, Richard and the Crusaders are within sight of the walls of Jerusalem. They can see the city sights, they can smell the city smells. They are that close. However, Richard is unable to take and hold the city. He knows this, so that's why he sees it in January, sees it again in July, as he's trying to figure out a way the best military and logistical way to take the city. Richard is smart enough as a military commander to understand that it's one thing to take the city, it's another to hold it. And you don't want to expend all your energy, all your supplies, all your manpower in taking the city and just to lose it uh, several months later because you don't have enough defenders. Now, a lot is written about during the time period shortly after between the relationship of Saladin and Richard. They both very much mutually admire each other. And again, this is where kind of myth making and romanticization of this time period kind of clouds the truth of this. So lots of stories of this. And this very much becomes a way of explaining chivalry and how a knight is supposed to act for um, on campaign and in there. There's stories of Richard hearing that Saladin has been wounded in battle, and after the battle's over, Richard sends his doctors to go and check on him and try to treat him if he can't. Saladin hears Richard has fallen ill and is not doing very well, so he sends his doctors to his camp. So there's stories like that. You got to take them with a grain of salt because, again, this very much becomes wrapped up in the age of chivalry, but very much this is rooted in a little bit of fact. What ends up happening is the third major event of the Third Crusade is in September of 1192. Richard I needs to get back home to Europe. And so what he does is he cuts a deal and he reaches a truce with Saladin to be able to, one, leave with honor, saying, hey, I was able to do this, but also understanding that no more further bloodshed is going to have to result from this. So the results of the Third Crusade come out of this truce. One, politically, Jerusalem is to stay under Muslim control. So the Muslims are able to politically gain control of the city. It's theirs. The second thing that happens is that this is again part of the whole reason the Crusades launched to begin with. Saladin promises that any unarmed, and unarmed is the key word, Christian pilgrims could have any free access to the Christian holy places in Jerusalem. And so that's kind of the compromise that each gets, right? Richard compromises in letting the city stay under Muslim control. Saladin compromises by allowing unarmed pilgrims free access to the holy places, which is what the pilgrims and the Christians of Europe truly want to begin with. So a couple distant slides, pictures just kind of showing the fighting here that we have of Richard going and fighting against Saladin in there. So Third Crusade is now over. What's the effects of the Third Crusade? What are we setting up for our Fourth Crusade? Number one, control of Jerusalem is now used to unify the Muslim world. The Muslims have successfully not only taken the city back from the Crusaders, however, they've been able to then fend off attacks to retake the city. Right? The focus now of not just taking Jerusalem, but is now to kick these Crusaders out of the Middle East to be able to hold on to it for the Muslims. The second major effect is kind of piggybacking off of that is with the loss of Jerusalem and not even able to take it, it kind of undermines the whole purpose of the Crusaders in the Middle East here. So the Christians' hold on the Holy Land is tenuous and begins to slowly erode more and more and more and more. In other news, Richard is unable to get back to England like how he wants. He gets caught up in other family squabbles. His uncle is going to kidnap him and hold him for ransom in Germany. Becomes a big, giant thing. His brother John is making a mess of it, and it gets a little bit of the English history that we'll get into in our next lecture. And then finally, as we said, legends grow about the relationship between Richard and Saladin, particularly writing about in this great age of chivalry and this kind of romanticism, not romantic love, but kind of making this out to be more than it was, more of an example of how knights should act rather than the reality that took place. So just a picture showing the, again, Crusaders at work here. If the Muslims have taken Jerusalem, that means that we got to call another crusade. So in 1198, Pope Innocent III calls the Fourth Crusade, which again, their goal simply retake Jerusalem. They become simple. We're repeating ourselves over and over again. So in November of 1199, French nobles agree to take up the cross. Now it's going to take them a little while to be able to get their affairs in order and to kind of try to plan this out because they don't want to end up in failure like the Third Crusade. So in February of 1201, they decide that they're going to make a contract with the merchants of Venice to have the Venetians build ships for the Crusaders to transport the Crusaders from Venice to Palestine to be able to then go on the crusade there. So the Venetians say, we'll agree. They start building the boats and they're ready to go and deliver them. Now, the Crusaders don't show up again until August of 1202. So if you're following along here, that's not just a year later, that's a year and 6 months later. That's 18 months later. So that's the first issue there. They show up in August of 1202 without enough money to pay for the ships that they've contracted the Venetians to pay for. So this becomes a big problem if you're the Venetians because you are out a substantial amount of money because you decided to build these ships on credit. And now when the payment is due, the Crusaders don't have the money. So obviously the Venetians are upset. However, they're businessmen. They're willing to make a deal. So this is where kind of the second goal of the Fourth Crusade kind of comes in. So the overarching goal, like we've seen through all the Crusades, is to retake Jerusalem. However, the Venetians need to get paid for the ships they've built to bring the Crusaders from Venice to Palestine. So the Venetians strike a deal by saying they're willing to forgive payment if the Crusaders help them to take back the city of Zara. Now, Zara is across the Adriatic Sea in modern-day Croatia. This has been a city that's changed hands back and forth between Venice and some other people. Venice wants the city back. So the Venetians make the offer if the Crusaders go and help them take the city of Zara across the Adriatic in Croatia. This will then help the Venetians get back the money they're out, plus some more, for the ships that they build, and then from there they will go to Jerusalem. Now the Pope hears this, not happy. Importantly, Zara is in Croatia, which is in Europe, which means they are Christian. So these are Crusaders fighting Christians. This is not what crusading is supposed to be. So the first major event is the Fourth Crusade here. Is that the Crusaders go sail to Zara, take the city of Zara in late November of 1202. So that's our first major event here. So the Crusaders taking this Christian city to be able to pay back the debt they owe for the Venetians. So the Crusaders have come from France. They've arrived in Venice. They've now gone from Venice to the city of Zara. Remembers Venice is a city of a whole bunch of different islands connected by canals. They show up there, they take the city of Zara, they move on. Now, in April of 1203, the Crusaders leave for Constantinople. Hey, what's going on here? Why is this? So this becomes part of the reason of what makes the Fourth Crusade a little bit different from everybody else here. While the Crusaders are in Zara mopping up, out of the mist, out of the rubble of the city emerges the supposed Byzantine emperor's deposed son. So the son of the deposed Byzantine emperors arrives and begins to spin tales of vast wealth if the Crusaders help him put him back on the quote rightful throne end quote that he believes has been taken from him. So the Venetians, who remember are the ones in the boat, see a chance to make capital HUGE huge profits by taking the Crusaders, using the Crusaders as a hired army to sail to Constantinople, take over Constantinople, steal anything that's not nailed down, and go back. The Venetians are also seeing they can do this under the guise of religion because the Pope will want this to happen because this will bring Constantinople back under control of not just the Pope but Roman Catholicism. So the second major event of the Fourth Crusade is on June 24th, 1203. The Crusaders arrive in Constantinople. So if we're following along, they've taken the city of Zara in Croatia, fought against Christians. Now they moved into Constantinople, going and scheming and politicking their way to take over this city. So they're fighting, they're scheming, they're trying to get it gets them nowhere till eventually on April 13th, 1204, the Fourth Crusaders break into the city of Constantinople and have 3 days of rioting. They ransack, they loot the city, they steal anything that's not nailed down. Now remember, we ask usually here, what's the goal of the Fourth Crusade? The goal is to retake Jerusalem. What do they do at this point? They turn around and go home. Right? Crusaders go home. They make no further effort to drive towards Palestine. They're very much enriched themselves. It's successful in their eyes. They've gone and they go back home. They're happy with this. So what's the result of the Fourth Crusade here? Well, the result is Constantinople is now controlled by the Latins, controlled by ostensibly the Venetians, but very much by the Roman Catholic Church. And if they only went to Constantinople, then Jerusalem is still controlled by the Muslims. So that's the end result here of the Fourth Crusade. So here we have our Crusaders arriving outside the walls of Constantinople, going and trying to figure out how they're going to get in there, and then going and marching on the city, getting around and inside the famed walls of Constantinople and getting in there. So if you go to Venice today, and the major cathedral is St. Mark's Cathedral in St. Mark's Square in Venice, and as you're walking through the doors of St. Mark's in Venice, you look up, you will see four bronze horses. And you might say, this is an interesting iconography to have on a Catholic church here. Well, those four bronze horses that are outside St. Mark's today are recreations of the four bronze horses that were originally there, brought back from the city of Constantinople, that were over the gates of the Hippodrome, the famous chariot racing stadium in Constantinople. So those horses, you can see those in the museum in Venice today. Those are a big deal. And again, Constantinople has been politely asking for them back ever since, and Venice is, yeah, we're going to keep them. So the effects of the Fourth Crusade are several. One is that even though the Constantinople, the city, has been taken over by the Latins, the Byzantine Empire doesn't fall. They're able to regroup. Latin rule is going to end in 1261, and the Byzantine Empire is going to continue on for another roughly 200 years. As you probably can imagine, this did not help end the schism in the church. It actually made things much, 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 much worse, and it didn't really help anything. We saw that it did not help the kingdom of Jerusalem in any way, shape, or form. And one of the effects of the Fourth Crusade is that the Fourth Crusade never fought anyone but Christians. And really, the major effect of the Fourth Crusade is it only managed to make relations between the Byzantines and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East and the Europeans, the Roman Catholic Church in the West, much, 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 much worse. So those are the four major crusades that we want to talk about. Again, we could keep going depending on the historian, depending on the book you read. You can get up into Crusades 12, 13, 14, 15. But we just want to highlight a few others, major ones that have some a little bit are interesting, that help color this crusading time period that we're talking about. The Children's Crusade originated in the north of France around the town of Chartres. Now, the Children's Crusade was dealing with a lot of different movements of discontent, unhappy with how the Fourth Crusade ended up, enthusiastic with how well the Albigensian Crusade is going. We'll talk about that more in a second. The Pope went and called for a procession. So in the spring of 1212, this procession was met and led by youths ages 6 to 14, who then took this procession and said, hey, let's go on crusade themselves. And so this army of elementary school and middle school students, right, so 14-year-olds or eighth graders, thinking of them being in charge of 20 to 30, I think it's like 10 to 30,000 is the estimate on there, worked their way towards Germany and then south towards Italy. Now, the people are, look at all these kids, and this is great. Look how religious our kids are. We just love this. So the people supported them. The clergy doesn't, because an army of 7,000 to 30,000 6 to 14-year-olds is wild and nuts. Okay, and so the clergy is using their level heads here and saying, this is ridiculous and makes no sense, and tries to steer them away. Eventually, some of them make it down to Italy, and some leave for the Holy Land. But remember, these are 6 to 14-year-olds, so most can't pay for the trip. So what ends up happening to a lot of them is they're sold into the slave markets of the Mediterranean. So it's a big, giant mishmash. But again, this really is a great example of the crusading kind of impetus, the crusading pulse, the crusading mindset that Europe is in by the time you get to the 1200s. Another crusade that we can talk about is the Reconquista that takes place in Spain. And so Pope Urban II calls for Spanish knights to stay in Spain, to not go to the Holy Land on the First Crusade. Why? Because remember, there's already Muslims in Spain. There's the Umayyad Caliphate that's taken over the Iberian Peninsula. So these Spanish knights don't need to go very far to fight Muslims because there's Muslims right in their own backyard. By the mid 1100s, fighting in Spain has been elevated to that of a crusade by various different popes. And you have to remember that in the long run, the Reconquista in Spain is going to hurt crusades against Jerusalem just because these crusades are, again, it's cheaper and it's easier to get to Spain than it is to get all the way to Jerusalem. It's closer, it's cheaper, so that's kind of the drive. So this kind of funnels knights that could have been helping in retaking Jerusalem and allows them to stay in Spain and slowly over time drive the Muslims out of Spain. The Reconquista in Spain is going to end in 1492 with the conquest of the last Muslim outpost in Spain of Granada. And the same year sees the expulsion of the Jews in Spain, which kind of creates a quote Catholic country. We can get in the ins and outs of what that means in more detail some other time. So the GIF here is just going to show you that again, slowly over time, the Catholics and the Spanish begin to push the Muslims out of Spain during the Reconquista as they're able to reconquer, for our non-Spanish language speakers out there, the country of Spain. The German Crusades take place in the east of Europe and the northeast, where it's important to understand that these northern Crusades differ in that the Crusaders feel both a religious and, the key word here is and, a cultural ethnic superiority over the pagan slaves and Balts of this area. The German Crusades are a very long, grinding, brutal affair, as the German and Central European Catholic knights really are slowly working their way eastward. The German Crusades are led by the religious order called the Teutonic Knights. And this is similar to what we see with the Knights Templar or the Hospitallers, other religious orders, which kind of think of these almost as monks that are knights and knights that are monks, fighting monks, if you will. By 1245, the Pope has declared these German Crusades a permanent crusade to anybody who goes and fights with the Teutonic Knights. And these are actually somewhat successful in that the German Crusades run out of pagans to fight, and they end up really just battling Catholic Poles in the Central Eastern European region. So those are the Teutonic Knights. A final major crusade we want to talk about is the Albigensian Crusade. And the Albigensian Crusade was launched against heretics in the town of Albi in the south of France. Now, these particular, quote, heretics, end quote, are Cathars. And these were a group of people who were religious dualists who believe that God and Satan were both eternal powers and co-equal, in that Satan has a ton of power and created the material world, but obviously Satan is bad, so the material world is bad. Whereas God, being good, created the spiritual world, and there's a whole lot of stuff in there. And this is a continuation that we've seen over the course of Christian discourse, trying to figure out. Really, this dates back to the early Christian days of how much of a God is Jesus. Is Jesus 100% God? Is he 100% man? Is he 50-50? Where does that lie into? And again, you get to like the Gnostics and the Manichaeans. So there's a lot of stuff that's coming in there. So these are the one people who have kind of taken Christianity and gone in a separate direction from what the Catholic Church says Christianity is. So the Catholic Church says, no, we don't like this. So in October of 1208, the Pope goes to northern French nobles, particularly the King of France, who really doesn't have a whole lot of power in the south of France, and says, hey, would you like to go on crusade to go against these Cathars? The fighting is going to last until 1229, until it's quote on over end quote. The Cathars, as kind of a nebulous organization, are still going to be organized for about another 100 years, particularly amongst the women of the area. But they're going to eventually, over time, lose the protection of the southern French nobility, and they're going to kind of fade away. The Albigensian Crusade, in terms of the Crusades, is not that big of a deal, but it is a giant deal in terms of French history, because the real winner in the Albigensian Crusade is the King of France, who is able to use these Crusades to interject his power in the southern part of France and extend his kingdom. Really, in the 1100s, the King of France really is just around the Ile-de-France, around Paris, and that's really all the power he has. And so what we see here in the 1200s, particularly when we get into our next video on Philip Augustus, is where the King of France really starts to reclaim what is his that we saw with Charlemagne and assert the dominance of the King of France from the English Channel to the Mediterranean. So that's what we're seeing here, where the Catholic Church is yelling at the Cathars and they're being expelled on the Albigensian Crusade. So we're going to finish up here as our Crusaders are returning home and they're old and they're tired. What are the effects of the different Crusades here? What we see here, the Crusades are an example of a major power of the church in the Middle Ages. Like we saw in the beginning of the last video, the Crusades mark the high point of the Catholic Church in Europe. From this power of 1098, Pope Urban II calling for a crusade and 100,000 people stopping what they're doing and going, it's only going to be downhill to where you see Europe today, for a couple different reasons we'll get in the second semester, being very unreligious than what we saw here 1,000 years ago. Merchants used the Crusades to expand trade between Europe and the southwest of Asia. This is going to be a major influx of new spices and materials and goods that the Europeans get a hankering for and a demand for. And when we see in the 1450s Constantinople taken over by the Muslim Turks, the Ottomans raising prices to the point where the Europeans say we can't pay them or we won't pay them, so we're going to go around there. This is, again, we talked about the Crusades being kind of a push that's going to start this movement towards an age of exploration out of Europe. Over time, the Crusades weakened the power of the Pope as the Pope kept calling for the crusade, and as we saw these crusades not working out militarily, economically, politically for the Pope's power in Rome. However, the Crusades did strengthen the power of the kings, who were able to use the logistical needs of rallying troops and getting them supplied to be able to build up their own power and to be able to use that power against the Catholic Church to assert their own political power in their own kingdoms. The last major effect we see is an intolerance increase between Christians, Muslims, and Jews that will only kind of increase in its intensity, not only between Christians and Christians themselves, like we saw between Eastern Orthodox and Catholics and Cathars, but between Christians and Muslims, Christians and Jews, and we'll continue to see this play out through the rest of the time period between this history and our modern day society. So we still see remnants of the Crusades in the realm today. If you go to Damascus, there is in Syria, there's the giant bronze statue of Saladin still standing. On the left here is a political cartoon from 1917 when the British World War I General Allenby goes and marches the British Army into Jerusalem. And this is very much fraught with symbolism, and Allenby knows exactly what he's doing. And you can see in the cartoon he's clothed in the clothes and the trappings of a crusader. On the other side, this is a German political cartoon from World War One, again putting the German army in, again elevating to that of a crusade. We see this in other instances as well, here with George W. Bush going into Iraq, kind of trapped in this magazine cover. I think it says from 2001 as a crusader, and then again you see crusaders, say, in this tobacco ad from the 1800s, 1900s. So that'll end our study of the Crusades, and we begin to look into some more political history, particularly in England and France, in our next lecture.